Welcome students. This is going to be a series on George Eliot's Middlemarch. In Module 1, we are going to begin with a discussion of the 19th century, a plate of George Eliot. If we look at the 19th century English novel, we need to understand that the genesis of the novel itself. So the rise of the novel can be traced pretty much to the late 17th century with writers like Afraben, who wrote Oronuku, and it is considered to be an early novel. But it is in the mid-18th century that the novel as a genre can be seen in concrete form. The emerging genre of the novel focused on the ordinary person who was seen as worthy of being the protagonist of the novel. And this is a very important point because prior to this, the genres didn't really speaking focus on the ordinary person. So we have several novels that appear in the 18th century and also as experimental novels. You know, they experiment with the genre, lending to it their own, that makes the genre of the novel what it really speaking is. So for instance, the chief proponents can be considered to be Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson, Lawrence Sterne. And it must be marked that the style of each of these was very different from each other's. But the one thing that was common to all these writers was the concern with the ordinary and the commonplace. The rise in the establishment of the novel as a genre also needs to be related to ideas that came into being with the French Revolution, the ideas of liberty, fraternity, and equality. At the same time, one can mark milestone achievements in the field of science and invention at the end of the 18th century. The use of steam as power, machines such as the spinning jenny, the mule, completely changed the process of production, which is why when we move into the 19th century, we talk about the Industrial Revolution and the rise of a very important social group that we call to be the middle class. So, if the early 19th century is known for English Romantic poetry, then this is also the period that is known for the realist novel, both in Europe and in England. The end of the 18th century in this sense culminates with new possibilities, or rather we can say that the 19th century begins with new possibilities that were to transform the face of the society. If we look at the key aspects of the 19th century, we are looking at industrialization, establishment of railways, and all these factors lead to the consolidation of a middle class that was gradually becoming very, very powerful. Ideas of liberty and equality had reconfigured power equations in society. So on the one hand, the aristocracy was displaced, but on the other, it also reappears in the 19th century in a modified form by drawing from the powerful sections of the bourgeois class. This can also be seen as a period of great social and political reform that takes on from the period that is the previous age, but it was also very, very different from that in the 18th century. For example, if we look at the 18th century, we have the enclosure system, and there had been a vast exodus of people from the rural areas and villages to the cities. The demography in that sense was changing, and London was soon to be transformed, what with the establishment of the railroads and the industries. This meant a sizable working class population in the cities, and the literature of the time clearly reflected these changes. The demarcation between the city and the countryside became quite clear. And here you have in front of you the view of Whitehall from Trafalgar Square, London. It's a photograph that was taken in 1839, an early photograph. So this is actually, you can see a kind of blur in the photograph, and this blur is because of the pedestrian and the carriage traffic. So, Monsieur de Sainte Croix has probably, clicked what is called the first daguerreotype photograph. And image, really speaking, of course, it was reversed to show the scene as it was, as this method produced only reversed views. But the idea is it shows you very clearly about the way in which the kind of picture we are looking at, how it was changing with smoke, how it was changing with the way in which the kind of people that were, there was an increase in population, really speaking, over here. And this is from 1839. So if we look at the 19th century, it takes on in a new way from philosophical debates at the end of the 18th century. We have Tom Paine's Rights of Man, we have Edmund Burke's Reflection on the Revolution in France. All these are written at the end of the 18th century, but they set the tone for debates around the idea of freedom and liberal humanism in the 19th century. The question then to be asked was, what does it mean to be free? So at the beginning of the 19th century, when these ideals did not evolve in the way in which people had imagined them to be, as constructive and affirmative, when people saw violence and anarchy around them, there was also a mood of disillusionment that set in, which was of course captured by the more mature romantics and triggered discussions around these ideas, questioning also as to what, really speaking, was the possibility of constructive and affirmative ideas. We look at something that was very popular, which was called the laissez-faire, or the leave alone, or the free market dictum. Now this of course stemmed from ideas by economists like Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations was very popular. But this also meant that not just the market, but scientific invention, technology would also lead to widespread changes. However, at the same time, the way in which society was concretizing in the 19th century, it was also leading to the concentration of wealth in the hands of only a few. The consolidation of the middle class in that sense led also to a demand for political representation, and this led to a series of reform bills. So we have the 3 reform bills of the 19th century that determined the trajectory of social change in England. The first is in 1832, the second in 1867, and the third in 1884. It led to a gradual expansion of the House of Commons, but more importantly, the need for political, social representation and assertion. So if we look at the first reform bill, we are looking at what is called an Act to amend the Representation of the People in England and Wales, or a Representation of the People Act, in which anyone with the property of around £10 could vote. So people from industrial towns could also vote. The rotten boroughs were done away with. When we move to the second reform bill, it is the working people from the towns who could vote. And when we look at the reform bill of 1884, which comes in that sense towards the end of the 19th century, we see how the vote was extended to the agricultural laborers. So in all of this, it's against this social, economic, political backdrop we see the ascension of Queen Victoria to the throne in 1837, and the ideas of free trade, industrialization, steam power. All these things meant that production, in a sense, was going to be looked at very differently. It multiplied, printing, cloth manufacture, all these increased manyfold. Here we can see towards the end of the 19th century, we can see the Bank of England, and we can see the huge traffic that is there outside the Bank of England. It tells us, how from the beginning towards the end of the 19th century, there was a major change in the way in which society was shaping in England in the 19th century. If you were to look at this, there is a quotation, and share this with you. A good deal of 19th century writing is concerned with discussion of democracy and individualism, of nationalism and liberalism, of the growth of population and the need for controls or for emigration. Education becomes a general concern, and the place of religious teaching in a national system of education is bitterly debated. The dominant temper of the early and middle Victorian periods are intensely moralistic, heavy with responsibility and anxiety. And these are concerns that we can see are well reflected in the works by writers of that period. So in the mid-19th century, we of course have Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species. We have works by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels on class antagonisms. It completely changed the way in which the world was perceived, and this reflected the way in which the writers perceived their own environment. In terms of the novel, early 19th century, we can see the works by Balzac in France, Turgenev in Russia, we have Flaubert in France, Charles Dickens and Carlyle in England took these changes into account and represented them in their novels. So we can broadly say that the writing style of the 19th century novel laid great emphasis on social realism. Novels such as Hard Times and Oliver Twist and many others by Dickens focused on the plight of the working class, especially the children in the workhouses. Prevailing theme of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, with its dictum of the greatest good for the greatest number, was critiqued from the point of view of the ordinary people, and this of course found representation in the novels of Dickens. Carlyle's Sartor Resartus and the French Revolution also appeared in the 19th century. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and we have towards the latter part of the 19th century, Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy also appear. So we can see the wide range of topics are all to do with the way in which things are changing in society and how that is represented in terms of human social relations by their portrayal in the form of the novel. In the domain of religion, we can see many factions that emerge in the 19th century, right from Methodism to evangelicalism, and other forms of dissent could be seen. If we look at the nature of the people who were the readers, that's the Victorian reading public, by the time we reached the Victorian period, the reading public had also expanded significantly. As you can see, the pictures that I shared earlier show an increase in population. It also meant that there would be a need for more books in terms of both quantity and quality. We had the circulating libraries in that period that came in handy for this reason. But here too, the developed machines, machines that were used for production of books, meant more books in the market. So the society, with its democratic approach, industrial setting, and invention, made it possible for more and more people to be educated. And it is therefore no surprise that we have the Education Act of 1870 that ensured compulsory education for children between the ages of 5 to 13 in England and Wales. And this meant that the literate population would go up. This also brings us to women and the novel, really speaking. And we look at how women and the novel is a very, very important category here. The novel as a genre matured in many ways in the hands of its women writers. Writers like the Bronte sisters, Elizabeth Gaskell towards the latter part of the 19th century, George Eliot, led to the novel their own style. And it must needs be marked how all these women used the male pseudonym to write novels. Was there a reason for this? If so, what was it? One also needs to examine this question in the light of the relationship between women and the whole process of writing. As Gilbert and Gubbar have also kind of, mentioned this anxiety in a sense of authorship. But before that, the work of the women novelists, and I quote from the Pelican Guide, the work of the women novelists Elizabeth Gaskell, Charlotte and Emily Bronte, and George Eliot represent a considerable social deepening of the novel as a portrayal of English life, and increase in its capacity to analyze moral and emotional nuances. It also marks a closer relationship between the activity of novel writing and the most serious and sincere conviction of writers. So in terms of form, when we move from the 18th to the 19th century, we leave behind the epistolary form, the picaresque novel, and so on. But we see how the novel as a form becomes both deeply personal and social, especially in the hands of its women writers. It engaged itself both with the constitution of the individual as subject in society and the society itself. Moral and social dilemmas, in this sense, were presented against the backdrop of a society that was marching ahead towards progress. And this, I think, is a very important question, because when we are looking really speaking, at the 19th century, and we are looking at a period where there are so many novels that are written by by the women, and how for them we need to understand how writing is not simply something that they're doing for leisure, but the idea of writing as a vocation, as something that we can call a kind of profession for the women writers, appears around this time. And this is a very, very significant takeaway actually from the 19th century. And which is why when Elaine Showalter documents the history of writing by women, she actually begins with the 19th century and talks about how women in the 19th century formed what she calls a female subculture, because here we have women for the first time who are asserting themselves and who are taking to writing as a vocation. At the same time, what are their topics? What are the themes that they are using? So the themes that they were broadly looking at showed the kind of concerns that women had in the 19th century, and the novel as a genre became a very important moment in that sense that could be used to actually almost chronicle and document the history of women and their social lives, in a sense. The history of the period, yes, but also women and their social lives. So, so far, when we've discussed the social, economic and political landscape of the 19th century and the literary landscape with mention of important writers, but the shift that we have made now is towards the novel as a genre and its relationship with women, how the novel evolves as a genre because of the contribution of the women writers. So, and in this context, the whole idea of the use of pseudonyms becomes very, very important. And Elaine Showalter, as I said, refers to the feminine novelists. The novelists of this period are referred to as the feminine novelists by her for their presentation of the female subculture, the anxieties, contradictions of being a woman in a Victorian society were important, and at the same time, being a writer had very important, significant overtones for the woman writer. And if when we talk about the pseudonyms, we know that George Eliot's real name was Mary Ann Evans, and Charlotte Bronte, for instance, who wrote Jane Eyre, took on Currer Bell. Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights, took on Ellis Bell, and Anne Bronte, who wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, took on Acton Bell. And what was the reason for this? And in the very famous book, The Mad Woman in the Attic, Gilbert and Gobar write that where women like Finch and Bradstreet apologized for their supposed inadequacies, while women like Ben and Cavendish flaunted their freakishness, the most rebellious of their 19th century descendants attempted to solve the literary problem of being female by presenting themselves as male. In effect, such writers protested not that they were as good as men, but that as writers they were men. And quotes close. So this is an important idea, that when they took on the male pseudonym, what is it? What was the reason? Why did they take on a different name? And why is it that they wanted to write what they did, not in terms of taking on the mantle of the woman, but taking on the mantle of the man? And I think the reasons are quite clear. Given the context of the society, the women wanted to portray the real social conditions and thought that it would probably be easier to do so with the use of the male pseudonym. So if the 19th century was a period of massive social change, I think post-1850s, and especially this is the time period when George Eliot as a writer is very, very important, we need to understand that the 19th century was also a very important period for its representation of women's issues and consolidation of women writers who asserted themselves. And that is why in the 19th century we see some very important acts that were passed. There was the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, Married Women's Property Act of 1870. Marriage, in this sense, was then to be seen not as a sacred, inviolable bond, but as a contract. And that, again, is an important shift in terms of social relations, especially in a patriarchal society, in a society in which, gender is, it plays a very important role in a certain sense. So, women's access to the money that they got from their families or the money that they earned, this money was should belong to them and not to their husband. And so the women had to actually put up a very, very strong, bitter fight. The most famous case here was that of Caroline Norton, who fought for this. And I'll quote from a letter to the Queen where she said, "A married woman in England has no legal existence. Her being is absorbed in that of her husband. She has no possessions unless by special settlement. Her property is his property." Right? So we see, and it is this, the fact that women did not get to keep their children, or women did not get to keep their assets, led to an outburst of anxiety and led to women writing tracts, pamphlets, letters, novels, non-fictional writing in which they documented their concerns. So we have writers like Harriet Martineau, we have Harriet Taylor Mill, who wrote on marriage, Caroline Norton, of course, who brought out the sheer helplessness of women in their marriage and their inability in that sense because of the legal clauses to step outside of it. So here, I would like to bring in Harriet Taylor Mill, who wrote a very famous essay called The Enfranchisement of Women. And, this is in a sense a prelude to what is going to happen right at the beginning of the 20th century, which is the entire suffrage movement. Harriet Taylor Mill says, and I quote from The Enfranchisement of Women, "This question is the enfranchisement of women, their admission in law and in fact to equality in all rights, political, civil and social, with the male citizens of the community. For with what truth or rationality could the suffrage be termed universal while half the human species remain excluded from it?" So this is, I think we need to think a little bit about the way in which concerns related to women's position in society are being expressed in terms of articles, pamphlets, political, non-fictional writing, and at the same time in their literary writing, that is in literature, in fiction, in the form of the novel. And one of the important questions that Harriet Taylor Mill raises is that if we are talking about a true, rational, just society, how can it be so if the women do not have the right to vote? So with this, we understand that when we look at the entire journey, really speaking, of the 19th century, we are looking at the consolidation of the middle class. We are looking at the establishment of industries, the formation of what is called both the village and the city as two clearly demarcated spaces. These spaces existed, but the demarcation is very clear. The whole process of production has given us a new class of people, a class of people that are working in the factories and are working in the industries. And this form of economic, this change in the economic form, led to a lot of consolidation of power in the hands of the emerging middle class that consolidates itself in a very big way in the 19th century. And this, in a sense, takes us, really speaking, to the whole journey of the reform bills. And the reason I especially brought in the reform bills is because George Eliot refers to the reform bill, especially the first reform bill is, where she's pitching Middlemarch to be. So if this is a period of consolidation, then this is also a period of great turbulence. And the turbulence comes from the women writers. The turbulence comes from free thinkers. The turbulence, in a sense, comes from women who are talking about equal rights for women, who are talking about the assertion of women. So when we look at the consolidation of the novel as a genre in the hands of its women writers, we need to understand it against this entire backdrop, the backdrop of change, the backdrop of assertion, the backdrop of an affirmation and optimism that is going to consolidate maybe the middle class at one end, but also lead to changes that are going to be very, very meaningful for the women of that society. Thank you.